Not every miracle begins with a voice from the sky. Some begin quietly, on an ordinary street, on a cold morning, with a simple lunchbox in a child's hand. If you believe that a small act of kindness can change an entire life, stay with this story. And if you're drawn to stories that restore faith, courage, and compassion in a broken world, subscribe to the YouTube channel Heaven Walks With Us, where every story is a reminder that heaven still walks among us. The cold arrived early that morning in Chicago. Not the kind that fell softly as snow, but the sharp, unforgiving cold that crept through jackets and settled deep in the bones. The South Side looked the way it always did in winter. Brick apartment buildings darkened by age, rusted fire escapes clinging to their walls, and narrow sidewalks cracked by decades of footsteps. Ethan Miller pulled the door of his family's ground-floor apartment closed behind him, careful not to let it slam. He was 11 years old, thin for his age, with shoulders already used to carrying more than a backpack. He zipped up his worn coat, the fabric frayed at the cuffs, and adjusted the old backpack hanging from one shoulder. One strap had been sewn back together with white thread, the stitches uneven but strong. In his right hand, Ethan carried his lunchbox. It was a small blue plastic box, scratched and faded, but clean. Inside was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich wrapped neatly in wax paper, a ripe banana, and a small carton of milk. His mother had packed it hours earlier, before leaving for her overnight shift at the nursing home. She always did, no matter how tired she was. Ethan walked carefully along the sidewalk, stepping around thin sheets of ice and puddles left behind by yesterday's rain. He passed the closed laundromat, its fluorescent lights already buzzing, and the empty parking lot where weeds pushed through cracked asphalt. At the corner stood the old church. It hadn't been open in years. The wooden doors were chipped and swollen from weather, the paint peeling away in long strips. The cross above the entrance leaned slightly to one side, as if even it were tired. Most people in the neighborhood avoided the place. Kids whispered stories about it. Nothing good, they said, ever came from there. But Ethan always noticed it. Every morning, he slowed just a little when he passed, though he never knew why. Something about the silence of the building made him look twice. That morning, he slowed more than usual, because someone was sitting on the church steps. A man. He was thin, wearing a light jacket far too weak for the cold, his shoes worn and cracked at the soles. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't calling out. He simply sat there, hands resting calmly on his knees, watching the street as if he had nowhere else he needed to be. Ethan felt it immediately. A strange, quiet certainty settled in his chest. This morning was not going to be like the others. Ethan slowed his pace without realizing it. The man sat on the cold stone steps of the abandoned church as if the chill didn't touch him. His posture was relaxed, almost deliberate, his back straight, his shoulders loose. Sorry, he didn't huddle for warmth or rub his hands together. He simply sat there, breathing calmly, watching the quiet street wake up. Ethan told himself to keep walking. That was the rule his mother had taught him early on. Don't stare, don't stop, don't talk to strangers, especially not this close to the old church. But something about the man made it hard to look away. It wasn't pity Ethan felt, and it wasn't fear either. It was closer to curiosity, mixed with a calm he didn't know how to explain. As Ethan passed the bottom of the steps, the man turned his head slightly. Their eyes met. They were dark, steady, and kind in a way Ethan had rarely seen. Not the forced kindness of adults pretending to listen, and not the distracted kindness of people in a hurry. This was different. It felt complete, as if the man had nowhere else to be and nothing else to think about except this moment. "Morning," the man said. His voice was low and gentle, carrying easily through the cold air. Ethan stopped. For a second, he forgot where he was supposed to be heading. The school bell, the long walk, the math test he hadn't studied enough for. All of it faded. He nodded awkwardly, clutching his lunchbox a little tighter. "Morning," he replied. The man's eyes flicked briefly to the blue plastic box in Ethan's hand, then back to his face. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't gesture. He simply smiled, faintly, as if the sight alone meant something. Ethan felt his stomach twist. He hadn't eaten breakfast. He never did on school days. The sandwich in that box was all he would have until late afternoon, if he was lucky. His mother wouldn't be home until evening, exhausted from double shifts, and Ethan had learned long ago not to complain about hunger. Still, the thought came uninvited. He looks colder than I am. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The wind cut through the street, tugging at the man's thin jacket. For a brief moment, Ethan imagined himself sitting on those steps all day, watching people pass, hoping someone would notice. He swallowed. Ethan started, then stopped. His voice sounded small to his own ears. The man waited. He didn't rush him. He didn't fill the silence. Ethan looked down at his lunchbox. Then, without fully understanding why, he took a step closer to the church steps. His fingers moved on their own, unclipping the worn plastic latch. He opened the box and pulled out the sandwich, still wrapped carefully in wax paper. "Do you want my lunch?" Ethan asked. The words surprised even him. For a moment, the man didn't respond. He looked at the sandwich as if it were something fragile, something precious. Then he smiled, not wide, not dramatic, but warm enough to reach Ethan's chest. "Yes," the man said softly. "Thank you." And as he reached out to take it, he added quietly, "Thank you, Ethan." Ethan froze. The cold vanished. The noise of the street disappeared. Only one thought remained, loud and clear in his mind. How does he know my name? Ethan didn't let go of the sandwich right away. His fingers stayed wrapped around the wax paper as if his hands had forgotten how to move. The man's words echoed in his head, louder than the traffic beginning to stir at the end of the block. "Thank you, Ethan." No one had said his name out loud that morning. Not his mother, who had already been gone for hours. Not a neighbor. Not a teacher. There had been no reason for a stranger on the steps of an abandoned church to know who he was, yet the man looked at him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan slowly released the sandwich. The man accepted it with both hands, carefully, almost reverently, as though Ethan had given him something far more valuable than food. He didn't unwrap it right away. He simply held it, nodding once. "You didn't have to do that," the man said. Ethan finally found his voice. It came out barely louder than a whisper. How do you know my name?" The man's smile didn't fade, but his eyes softened. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he were looking past Ethan. Not at the street, not at the buildings, but somewhere deeper. "Names matter," he said. "And so do choices." That didn't answer anything. Ethan opened his mouth to ask again, but before he could, the man added something else. "What's given from the heart," he said gently, "always comes back. More than you expect." A chill ran up Ethan's spine, sharper than the cold air. He didn't understand the words, but they landed somewhere inside him, heavy and warm at the same time. Ethan shifted his backpack higher on his shoulder. The school bell would ring soon. He knew he should leave. He knew he should walk away and forget this strange moment, chalk it up to coincidence or imagination. But he couldn't. The man lowered his gaze to the sandwich at last, as if in quiet gratitude. Ethan glanced toward the street, where a bus roared past and a stray dog trotted along the curb, its collar dangling loose. When he looked back, the church steps were empty. The man was gone. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He took a step forward, then another, scanning the sidewalk, the alley beside the church, the narrow space behind the building. There was nowhere the man could have gone without being seen. No footsteps, no movement, no trace. Only the cold stone steps, dusted with leaves, exactly as they had been before. Ethan stood there, frozen, the silence pressing in around him. In his hand, he still clutched a small piece of wax paper that had torn loose when he let go of the sandwich. He stared at it as if it might explain what had just happened. People passed by at the end of the block, busy with their own mornings. No one seemed to notice anything unusual. No one asked if he was okay. Ethan finally turned away. He walked toward school with an empty lunchbox, his stomach already tightening with hunger. But something else filled the space where fear should have been. A strange calm, a quiet certainty that whatever had just happened on those church steps was not an accident and not something he would forget. As the school building came into view, Ethan glanced back once more. The church stood silent behind him. And though the man was gone, Ethan felt, with a clarity that startled him, that he had not truly been left alone. When Ethan returned home that afternoon, the apartment was quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that settled heavily in the air when no one had the energy to fill it with sound. The small living room was dim, lit only by the weak winter light slipping through the blinds. A folded blanket lay on the couch. A mug sat in the sink, untouched. His mother hadn't come home yet. Ethan set his backpack down by the door and kicked off his shoes. The heater hummed softly, struggling to keep up with the cold seeping through the walls. He moved through the apartment the way he always did, careful, practiced, as if he knew exactly how much space he was allowed to take up. On the kitchen counter lay a white envelope. It hadn't been there that morning. Ethan stopped. Okay. The envelope was thin, official-looking, with bold black letters printed across the front. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. He had seen envelopes like this before, taped to doors or slipped under them when landlords got tired of waiting. He picked it up anyway. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were short and sharp. Final notice. Pay or quit. The date at the bottom told him everything. They were already behind. Again. Ethan folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then slid it beneath a stack of mail his mother hadn't had time to open. She already carried enough weight. He didn't need to add more before she even walked through the door. He went to his room, really just a corner separated by a thin divider, and sat on the edge of his bed. His stomach growled, reminding him of the lunch he no longer had. He ignored it. Melissa Miller didn't get home until after 7. When she did, her shoulders sagged the moment she stepped inside. Her hair was pulled back tightly, dark circles beneath her eyes deeper than usual. She smiled when she saw Ethan, but it was the kind of smile that tried to hide exhaustion and failed. "Hey, kiddo," she said softly. "Homework done?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah." She set her bag down and rubbed her temples. The faint smell of disinfectant clung to her clothes, nursing home hallways and long hours on her feet. She worked nights there, then cleaned hotel rooms on weekends when she could get the shifts. 2 jobs, sometimes 3, still never enough. Melissa poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, her hands trembling just slightly. Ethan noticed. He always did. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she replied quickly. Too quickly. "Just tired." She glanced at the stack of mail, then away again, pretending she hadn't seen it. They both understood the unspoken agreement. Some things were not discussed until there was no choice left. Ethan went to heat up a can of soup for dinner. He poured it into a pot, stirred slowly, watching the steam rise. He thought about the church steps, about the man's voice, about the way he had said his name as if he had always known it. What's given from the heart always comes back. Ethan didn't know what that meant yet. All he knew was that his mother was wearing herself down trying to keep them afloat, and that something, somewhere between that cold morning and this quiet kitchen, had shifted. And whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of something that could not be undone. The next morning at school felt longer than usual. Ethan took his seat near the back of the classroom, sliding into the chair just as the bell rang. The room buzzed with voices, backpacks hitting the floor, chairs scraping against tile. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else complained about a quiz. It all blended together into the familiar noise of a place where everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Everyone except him. Ethan kept his head down as he pulled out his notebook. The pages were creased and worn, corners folded from months of use. He sharpened his pencil slowly, listening to the hum of the heater fighting the cold outside. When lunchtime came, the shift in energy was immediate. Chairs pushed back. Groups formed without effort. Friends moved together toward the cafeteria, talking about video games, weekend plans, and whatever was trending online. Ethan walked alone. The lunchroom smelled like reheated pizza and fries. He stood in line, eyes fixed on the floor tiles, until it was his turn. The cafeteria worker glanced at his student ID and nodded, sliding a tray toward him. "Free lunch," as she said gently. Ethan took the tray and moved on, pretending he hadn't heard. He always pretended. At a nearby table, Logan and a couple of other boys were already eating. Logan spotted Ethan and smirked. "Hey," he called out. "Didn't see your lunchbox today." A few kids laughed. Ethan stiffened, but kept walking. "What? You forget it?" Logan added. "Or are you giving your food away now?" The laughter grew louder. Ethan sat at the far end of the room, away from the noise. He stared at the food on his tray, a slice of pizza, canned fruit, a small carton of milk. It wasn't bad. He knew that. But it wasn't what the others saw. What they saw was the label, free lunch. He ate quickly, eyes down, chewing without tasting. Each bite filled his stomach, but it didn't ease the tightness in his chest. He reminded himself that none of this mattered, that getting through the day was enough. Across the room, a boy he didn't recognize sat alone too. Younger, smaller. He poked at his food, barely eating. Ethan noticed the way his shoulders slumped, the way he glanced around as if expecting someone to laugh at him next. For a moment, Ethan thought about walking over. He didn't. The bell rang before he could decide. "In the afternoon, Ms. Harper called on Ethan during math. He answered correctly, his voice steady. She nodded in approval and moved on. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the final bell rang and students poured into the hallways, Logan brushed past Ethan, bumping his shoulder. "See you tomorrow, charity boy," he muttered. Ethan didn't respond. He stepped outside into the cold, pulled his jacket tighter, and started the walk home. His stomach was full, but his heart felt heavier than it had that morning. Still, as he passed the corner where the old church stood, he slowed just for a second, and without knowing why, he whispered to himself, "Maybe it still matters how you act, even when no one's watching." Then he kept walking. The knock came before sunrise. It wasn't loud, just 2 soft taps against the apartment door, careful enough not to wake the neighbors. Ethan stirred in his bed, half dreaming, listening as the sound faded into silence. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it. Then he heard his mother's footsteps. Melissa moved quietly through the apartment, still wrapped in her sweater, hair loose from sleep. She opened the door just a crack, peering into the hallway. No one stood there. The corridor was empty, washed in the dull yellow light of a flickering bulb. But something sat on the floor, a brown paper grocery bag. She hesitated, then bent down and lifted it, glancing left and right as if whoever had left it might still be nearby. There was no note taped to the door, no sound of retreating footsteps, just the bag, warm against her hands, heavier than it looked. "Ethan," she called softly. He came out rubbing his eyes, still in socks. "What is it?" Melissa set the bag on the kitchen counter and opened it slowly. Inside were boxes of pasta, jars of peanut butter, canned soup, a carton of eggs, a bag of rice, even a small box of cereal. Not fancy, not new, but enough to matter. She stared at it in disbelief. Did you tell anyone we needed help?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "No." She pressed her lips together, trying to make sense of it. The church didn't call, and the city usually leaves a notice. They stood there in silence, the refrigerator humming behind them. "Maybe a neighbor?" Ethan offered, though he didn't believe it. Melissa looked at him, eyes glassy. "We don't really talk to anyone." She reached for the eggs, checking carefully to see if they were cracked. They weren't. Everything was intact, thoughtfully packed, as if whoever had done this wanted to help without being seen. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He thought of the church steps, of the calm voice, of the words that still echoed in his head. What's given from the heart always comes back. He didn't say anything. Melissa finally exhaled, a long, shaky breath. "Well," she said, forcing a smile, "looks like we're having a real breakfast." She moved to the stove, cracking eggs into a pan. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and grounding. Ethan sat at the small table, watching her shoulders relax just a little as she cooked. As they ate, neither of them spoke about miracles or strangers or abandoned churches. They talked about school, about work, about nothing important. But when Ethan left for school that morning, he noticed something strange. The paper bag wasn't empty. At the bottom, tucked beneath the cereal box, lay a small, folded slip of paper. He picked it up, turned it over once in his fingers, then slipped it into his jacket pocket without opening it. Outside, the air was cold again, sharp and unkind. But this time, as Ethan walked past the corner where the old church stood, his step felt lighter. Something had come back. And somehow, he knew it wasn't finished yet. Ethan didn't open the paper right away. It stayed in his jacket pocket through the walk to school, through first period, through math and history and the low hum of the classroom heater. Every time he shifted in his seat, he felt it there. Thin, folded, waiting. He told himself it was probably nothing. A grocery receipt, a store coupon, something ordinary. But ordinary things didn't usually make his chest feel this tight. It wasn't until late afternoon, after the final bell rang and the hallways emptied, that Ethan pulled it out. He sat on the steps outside the school, backpack at his feet, cold air brushing his face. He unfolded the paper. There were no logos, no printed lines, just a single sentence written in careful, steady handwriting. "What you gave will come back multiplied." Ethan stared at the words. His fingers traced the ink as if it might still be wet, but it was dry. Too dry. He was certain he had never seen this paper before. It hadn't been in his lunchbox. It hadn't been in his backpack. And yet, there it was, exactly where it shouldn't be. He folded it again and stood up. Instead of walking straight home, Ethan turned down Maple Street and headed 3 blocks east, toward his grandmother's apartment. Rosa Miller lived in a small, narrow building that smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Her door was always unlocked during the day. Ethan knocked once anyway. "Come in," her voice called out. She sat in her recliner near the window, a knitted blanket over her knees, a rosary looped loosely around one wrist. A small wooden cross hung above the doorframe. The television was off. It usually was. "Abuela," Ethan said softly. She smiled the moment she saw him. "You're early." Ethan didn't sit. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and held it out to her. "I found this." Rosa adjusted her glasses and took the note, reading it slowly. She didn't speak right away. Her expression didn't change, but her grip tightened just slightly. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. Then he told her everything. The church steps, the man, the sandwich, the name, the disappearance, the grocery bag. He spoke quickly, afraid that if he slowed down, he might lose the courage to finish. When he was done, the room was quiet. Rosa reached for the Bible on the side table and opened it without looking at the cover. She flipped through the pages, stopping at a place marked with a ribbon. She turned the book toward Ethan. "I was hungry and you gave me food," she read aloud. "I was thirsty and you gave me drink." Ethan swallowed. Do you think it was him?" Rosa met his eyes. Her gaze was steady, not excited, not fearful. "I don't know who you saw," she said gently, "but I know this. God doesn't always come with light and thunder. Sometimes he comes quietly, hungry, waiting to see what kind of heart is standing in front of him." She folded the note and placed it inside the Bible, closing it carefully. "Pay attention," she added, "not just to what happens next, but to what changes inside you." Ethan nodded. As he left her apartment, the sun dipped low, painting the street in pale gold. The cold was still there. The problems were still there. But the words followed him all the way home. "What you gave will come back multiplied." And for the first time, Ethan wondered if the miracle had already begun, not around him, but within him. The offer came 2 days later, just as the groceries were running low again. Ethan was cutting through the alley behind the corner store when Jay stepped out from behind the dumpster. Jay was older, 15, maybe 16, tall, broad-shouldered, with a hood pulled low and a confidence that came from knowing people stepped aside when he walked by. "Hey," Jay said. "You're Melissa's kid, right?" Ethan stopped. His instinct told him to keep moving, but Jay's voice wasn't threatening. It was casual, familiar, like this conversation had already been planned. "Yeah," Ethan replied carefully. Jay nodded toward the street. "I heard your mom's having a rough time. People talk." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What do you want?" Jay smiled. "Just a little. Relax. I'm not trying to mess with you. I'm trying to help." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small brown envelope. It wasn't thick, just heavy enough to notice. "I need someone to drop this off," Jay said. 5-minute walk, gas station on Fulton. You hand it to a guy behind the building. He gives you cash. Easy." Ethan stared at the envelope. "What's in it?" Jay shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Not your problem." "How much?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. Jay's smile widened. $200. For you? $200. Ethan's mind raced. $200 could cover groceries for weeks. It could pay part of the electric bill. It could help his mom breathe a little easier, even if just for a moment. Jay leaned closer. "No one gets hurt. No cops. You're a kid. Nobody looks at you twice." Ethan thought of the envelope at home, the final notice. His mother rubbing her temples at night, pretending she wasn't dizzy. The grocery bag that had appeared once and might never appear again. He also thought of the church steps, of a man who hadn't asked for anything, of a sandwich given freely, of words that still echoed in his chest. What's given from the heart always comes back. Ethan shook his head. "I can't." Jay blinked. "You serious?" "I don't want trouble," Ethan said. His voice trembled, but he didn't back down. "I'm not doing it." Jay's expression hardened. "You think being good pays the bills?" Ethan didn't answer. Jay scoffed and stuffed the envelope back into his jacket. "Suit yourself, but don't act surprised when nothing changes." He stepped past Ethan and disappeared down the alley. Ethan stood there long after Jay was gone, his heart pounding. Saying no hadn't felt heroic. It had felt terrifying, like turning down the only open door in a locked room. He walked home slowly, each step heavier than the last. That night, as he lay on his bed listening to the radiator hiss, doubt crept in. What if Jay was right? What if kindness didn't matter when rent was due and cupboards were empty? Ethan reached under his pillow and pulled out the folded note from his grandmother's Bible. He read it again in the dim light. "What you gave will come back multiplied." He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But he folded the paper carefully and put it back. For now, choosing not to cross that line would have to be enough. The call came just after noon. Ethan was in science class, copying notes from the board. When the office secretary appeared at the door and said his name, the room went quiet. A few students turned to look. "Miss..." Harper paused mid-sentence. "Ethan," the secretary said gently, "grab your things." His stomach dropped. They didn't explain anything in the hallway. They never did. Ethan followed her past the lockers, past the trophy case, his footsteps echoing louder than usual. At the front desk, the principal stood with a phone pressed to his ear. He hung up as Ethan approached. "Your mother had an incident at work," he said. "She's okay, but she needs you." The words blurred together. An incident. Okay. Needs you. The bus ride to the nursing home felt endless. Ethan stared out the window at streets he knew by heart, but everything looked different now, tilted, uncertain, as if the world had shifted a few inches off its axis. Melissa was sitting in a chair near the nurse's station when he arrived. Her face was pale, her hair damp with sweat. A paper cup of water rested in her hands, shaking slightly. "Hey," she said when she saw him. She tried to smile. It didn't quite work. "What happened?" Ethan asked, dropping his backpack. "I just got dizzy," she said quickly. "It's nothing." The nurse nearby didn't say anything, but her look said otherwise. They sent Melissa home early. No overtime, no extra shift, just rest. They said, hydration, follow up if it happened again. At home, Melissa lay on the couch with a blanket pulled to her chin. Ethan made her tea the way she'd taught him. Water just before boiling, honey stirred slowly. He set the mug down and sat on the floor beside her. I'm fine, she repeated. I just need sleep. Ethan nodded, but fear tightened around his ribs. That evening, the power flickered twice before settling back on. The refrigerator hummed. The heater clicked on and off, just struggling. Ethan opened the cabinet and counted what was left. A few cans. Half a box of pasta, peanut butter scraped thin. He did the math in his head. It didn't work. Later, when his mother fell asleep, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table and unfolded the envelope he had hidden days ago. The one he had tried not to think about. Pay or quit. 7 days. He pressed his palms flat against the paper until they ached. For the first time since the morning on the church steps, anger bubbled up beneath the fear. Not at his mother, not even at the world. At the silence. At the waiting. At the feeling of doing everything right and still slipping closer to the edge. He stood and paced the apartment, stopping in front of the door. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. Lights blinked on in windows that weren't his. Ethan grabbed his jacket. The pharmacy was only 3 blocks away. He told himself he was just going to look, just to see how much the medicine cost. Just to know. The bell above the pharmacy door chimed softly as he stepped inside. The place smelled clean, alcohol, wipes, and soap. Rows of shelves stood neat and full. Too full. Ethan walked past the aisles slowly, his heart pounding. He stopped in front of the pain relief section and stared at the bottles. Small, light, easy to hide. His hand hovered. For a moment, he thought of Jay, of the envelope, of how easy it would have been to say yes. For another moment, he thought of the church steps, of a sandwich given away, of a voice that had spoken his name without judgment. His fingers closed around one bottle. Just then, a voice sounded behind him. Can I help you with something, son? Ethan froze. Ethan's hand tightened around the bottle. He didn't turn around at first. His mind raced, searching for an excuse, a sentence that might make this moment disappear. The pharmacy was quiet, too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator cases along the back wall seemed suddenly loud. I asked if you needed help, the voice said again, calm and unhurried. Ethan turned slowly. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s, tall, with graying hair and wire-frame glasses perched low on his nose. His name tag read Mr. Carter, and there was no anger in his expression, no suspicion, just a tired kind of attentiveness, as if he'd seen this moment before, many times. Ethan swallowed. I was just looking, Mr. Carter nodded. That's usually how it starts. Ethan's chest tightened. His fingers loosened slightly, but the bottle was still in his hand. He could feel his pulse in his ears. Any second now, he thought, the shouting would start. Someone would grab his arm. The police would be called. Instead, Mr. Carter walked around the counter and stopped a few feet away. What's your mom's name? He asked. The question hit Ethan harder than any accusation could have. Melissa, Ethan said quietly. Mr. Carter studied his face for a long moment. Then he sighed. She works nights at Greenfield Nursing Home, doesn't she? Ethan's eyes widened. How do you know that? Because she picks up prescriptions here when she can, Mr. Carter replied. And because she always apologizes for being late. Ethan's throat burned. The bottle slipped from his hand and clattered softly onto the shelf. I wasn't trying to steal, Ethan said, the words tumbling out. She got sick today. We don't have money right now. I didn't know what else to do. His voice broke at the end. Mr. Carter didn't move. He didn't reach for the phone. He didn't raise his voice. Sit down, he said gently, nodding toward the small bench near the window. Ethan hesitated, then obeyed. Mr. Carter picked up the bottle, placed it back on the shelf, and disappeared behind the counter. When he returned, he carried a small paper bag. He set it on the bench beside Ethan and sat down too. "I grew up like you," Mr. Carter said. "Single mom, empty fridge, bills that never waited." Ethan stared at the floor. "There was a night I almost did exactly what you just did," Mr. Carter continued. "Someone stopped me. Not with punishment, with mercy." He pushed the paper bag closer. Inside were 2 bottles of medication, a box of tea, and a small jar of honey. "This will help her," he said. "Take it." Ethan looked up, stunned. "I can't pay—" "I know," Mr. Carter said. "You will someday, just not with money." He met Ethan's eyes. "Promise me something." "Yes," Ethan whispered. "Promise me you won't cross that line again. Not because you're scared, but because you know who you are." Ethan nodded hard, tears spilling over now. "I promise." Mr. Carter stood and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Come by on Saturdays," he added. "Sweep floors, stock shelves. It's not much, but it's honest." Ethan clutched the bag to his chest as he left the pharmacy. Outside, the air was cold and sharp again, but for the first time in days, he could breathe. He hadn't taken something that wasn't his. He had been given exactly what he needed, and somewhere deep inside, Ethan felt it clearly now. This was part of the return. Ethan started at the pharmacy the following Saturday. He arrived early, before the doors opened, the sky still pale and undecided above the street. Mr. Carter handed him a broom and showed him where the dust collected along the baseboards. It wasn't difficult work, but it mattered. Each sweep left the floor a little cleaner, the space a little more cared for. Customers came and went. Some nodded at Ethan. Others barely noticed him. A few older women lingered to chat, telling stories about their aching joints and their grandchildren who never called enough. Ethan listened. He learned to listen the way Mr. Carter did, without rushing, without judging. By the end of the morning, his arms were tired, but his chest felt lighter. Mr. Carter handed him a small envelope with a few bills inside. "For your time," he said. Ethan tried to refuse. Mr. Carter shook his head. "Honest work deserves honest pay." Ethan walked home, holding the envelope like it might disappear. He gave the money to his mother without explanation. Melissa looked at him for a long moment, then pulled him into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. The next week, Ethan noticed something while walking past the old church. Someone had placed a small wooden box near the steps. It was simple, unfinished wood, a hinged door, no sign. Inside were a few canned goods and a box of cereal. Nothing else. The sight stopped him cold. That evening, Ethan mentioned it to Mr. Carter. The pharmacist smiled. "A few neighborhoods do that," he said. "Community pantry. People take what they need, leave what they can." Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. By the end of the week, he asked around. A neighbor donated a coat. Another left a bag of rice. Someone taped a handwritten note to the box. "If you need it, take it. If you have extra, share it." At first, people were cautious. They walked past the box without looking, but hunger has a way of lowering pride. Soon, items disappeared, and then reappeared. Soup cans, gloves, baby formula, always quietly, always without names. Ethan watched it happen, amazed. Word spread. The box filled more often. A woman he'd never spoken to brought diapers. A man from 2 buildings overleft bottled water. Even Logan, the boy who used to tease him, walked by one afternoon and dropped in a bag of apples without saying a word. The church steps no longer felt abandoned. On Sundays, a few neighbors gathered there to talk. Nothing formal, just conversation, laughter, the kind that grows when people realize they aren't alone. Ethan didn't take credit. He didn't want it. He swept floors on Saturdays, stocked shelves, did his homework at night, helped his mom when she came home tired. But something had shifted. The fear that once pressed against his ribs had loosened its grip. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, Ethan stood by the pantry box and felt it again. That quiet certainty from the cold morning weeks ago. Not a voice, not a sign. Just the understanding that what he had given had not only returned, it had begun to move. And once it started moving, it didn't seem interested in stopping. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the street, followed by hurried footsteps. Ethan woke with a start, heart pounding, the sound lingering in the air long after it faded. He lay still, listening. The city settled back into its usual hum. Sirens in the distance. A car passing too fast. By morning, the truth was impossible to ignore. The wooden pantry box by the church steps was open, its door hanging crooked on one hinge. Inside Orem, there was nothing. No cans, no coats, no diapers. Even the handwritten note was gone, torn clean from the wood. Neighbors gathered quietly, standing in small clusters, their breath visible in the cold. No one spoke at first. The absence said enough. "Someone broke in last night," a woman finally said. "Took everything?" Ethan's chest tightened. He crouched down and touched the splintered edge of the door. It felt unreal, like waking up to find a dream, dismantled piece by piece. "It was bound to happen," someone muttered. "People ruin good things." A man shook his head. "What's the point of trying?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The words lodged in his throat. That afternoon, another blow landed. Melissa came home early, her face pale, a folded paper clenched in her hand. She didn't speak at first. She just sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall as if it might explain what the letter could not. "They sold the building," she finally said. "The new owner wants everyone out. 10 days. The room felt smaller. Ethan stared at the floor. 10 days. The number repeated in his head, hollow and loud. Everything they had been holding together, work, food, community, suddenly felt fragile again. That night, rain began to fall. Not heavy, but steady, tapping against the windows and the thin roof like a countdown. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the groceries that had appeared and vanished, of the people who had begun to hope, of the words he had believed in. What you gave will come back multiplied. Had he misunderstood? He slipped out of bed and sat at the small table, opening his notebook. His pencil hovered, then pressed down hard. What if I was wrong? The words stared back at him, dark and accusing. He closed his eyes and tried to pray, but nothing came. No warmth, no certainty, just silence, thick and heavy. Outside, the rain soaked the empty church steps. By morning, the pantry box had been boarded up. The street felt quieter than it had in weeks. People passed without looking at one another. The small flame that had begun to burn felt dangerously close to going out. Ethan stood at the window, watching the rain blur the city into gray lines. For the first time since that cold morning, fear crept back in. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady and convincing. Maybe Jay had been right. Maybe kindness didn't last. Maybe good things were only borrowed, never kept. Ethan pressed his forehead to the glass and whispered into the quiet room, unsure if anyone was listening at all. Was it ever real? The rain answered with silence. And yet, deep beneath the doubt, beneath the exhaustion, something small remained. A single, fragile spark. Not bright enough to comfort him, not strong enough to reassure him, but alive. Ethan left the apartment just after sunrise. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the streets dark and slick. The air smelled clean, almost sharp, the way it does after something heavy has passed. He walked without a destination, hands tucked deep into his jacket pockets, his notebook pressed against his side like a shield. He passed the pharmacy but didn't go in, passed the church without stopping. His feet carried him to the small park 3 blocks north, a place he rarely visited. The swings creaked in the wind. A thin layer of leaves clung to the damp ground. No one else was there. Ethan sat on a bench beneath a bare tree and stared at the empty page of his notebook. For weeks, the words had come easily. Thoughts, hopes, plans. Now, there was nothing, just questions that circled without answers. He closed his eyes. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a house. He didn't even ask for the pain to stop. He only whispered, "Please don't let this be for nothing." The wind moved through the trees. Ethan opened his eyes. Someone was standing a few steps away. It was the same man. Not thin this time, not worn down by cold. He stood upright, calm, dressed simply in clean, light-colored clothing that seemed untouched by the damp ground. His face was different, brighter, clearer, but unmistakable. The same eyes, the same quiet presence that made the world feel still. Ethan stood up slowly, his heart pounding. "You're real," he said, barely audible. The man smiled, not with triumph, but with understanding. "You never lost anything," he said. "You gave." Ethan swallowed hard. "They took everything. The food, the hope. We're losing our home." The man stepped closer, his voice steady and warm. "What was given in love cannot be stolen." "But nothing changed," Ethan said. His voice broke. "I tried to do the right thing. I tried to help, and it all fell apart." The man shook his head gently. "You changed." Ethan looked up, confused. "When one heart chooses light," the man continued, "it creates paths you cannot yet see. You are not the answer to every problem, but you are the beginning." Tears filled Ethan's eyes. "I'm just a kid." The man's gaze softened. "You are a light, and light does not argue with darkness. It shines." Ethan felt something settle inside him. Not excitement, not relief, but certainty. A deep, unshakable knowing that he was not abandoned, that he never had been. "Are you Jesus?" Ethan asked. The man smiled, neither confirming nor denying. "Who I am matters less than who you choose to be." The wind stirred again, stronger this time. Leaves lifted from the ground and spun briefly in the air. Ethan blinked. The bench across from him was empty. No footprints, no sound of retreat, only the park, quiet and ordinary once more. Ethan stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly. The fear that had gripped him for days loosened, not because the problems were gone, but because they no longer owned him. He opened his notebook and wrote one sentence. Carefully, "Even if everything looks lost, I am not." He closed the notebook and started walking back toward home. The eviction notice was still real. The pantry was still empty. The future was still uncertain. But something within him was no longer fragile. It was steady, and it was enough. The knock came early Monday morning. Not loud, not urgent, just firm enough to be heard. Melissa wiped her hands on a towel and went to the door, already bracing herself for what she expected to see. When she opened it, the hallway was empty, except for an envelope. It lay on the floor just inside the doorway, clean and deliberate, as if placed there with care. Melissa picked it up slowly. Her name was written on the front in neat handwriting. Her hands began to tremble. Ethan stepped closer as she opened it. Inside were several folded bills, enough to cover the overdue rent, enough to buy time. Tucked between them was a short note. "Keep building." Melissa pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet kind that comes when something heavy finally loosens its grip. They paid the landlord that afternoon. The eviction was paused. The new owner agreed to extend the lease. No explanations. No questions answered. The neighborhood noticed. Within days, people returned to the church steps. Someone repaired the pantry box. Someone else painted it. Another neighbor brought nails and wood. The broken hinge was fixed. The note was rewritten. Slowly, cautiously, the box filled again. Not all at once, not perfectly, but it filled. The church doors were cleaned, the windows patched. Someone hung a small sign. Community Center. All are welcome. No one claimed credit. No one needed to. Melissa found steadier work at a nearby bakery. She came home smelling of bread and sugar instead of disinfectant. She laughed more, slept better. Ethan kept working Saturdays at the pharmacy. He kept listening, kept helping. He never told anyone about the man on the church steps or the park bench. He didn't need to. Years passed. Ethan grew taller. His voice deepened. The city changed around him, but he stayed. He became a teaching assistant at the same school he once walked through with his head down, the same lunchroom, the same noise. One morning, he noticed a boy sitting alone at a table, staring at his food the way Ethan once had. Ethan reached into his backpack. He pulled out a lunch, peanut butter and jelly, wrapped carefully. "Here," he said, placing it gently on the table. The boy looked up, confused. "Why?" Ethan smiled. "Because someone once gave me theirs." The boy didn't fully understand. He didn't have to. That evening, Ethan walked past the old church. The pantry box was full. Laughter drifted from inside. Light spilled through the windows onto the sidewalk. He sat on the steps where it had all begun. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't wait for a sign. He simply closed his eyes and gave thanks, because he understood now what had taken him years to learn. The miracle was never about seeing Jesus. It was about choosing to live in a way that made others feel less alone. And that kind of miracle doesn't end. If this story moved you, let it remind you of something simple and powerful. Kindness is never wasted. If you want more stories that restore faith, courage, and hope in a world that desperately needs it, subscribe to the YouTube channel, Heaven Walks With Us. And don't leave just yet. Click the next video on your screen. Another story is waiting to walk with you.